You're standing at the edge of somewhere extraordinary, looking across at a place that will forever remain just out of reach. Maybe guards patrol its borders, maybe religious tradition keeps it closed, maybe nature itself has made entry a death sentence. There's something deeply human about this pull toward the forbidden, this desire to go precisely where we're told we cannot go. Throughout history, certain places have been sealed off from the world, some to protect us from what's inside, some to protect what's inside from us, and some simply because humanity decided that certain spaces are more valuable untouched. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore fascinating stories designed to ease you gently into sleep. Wherever you are right now, I'm so glad you've decided to join me for tonight's adventure. Tonight, we're journeying to 10 remarkable places on Earth that you will almost certainly never visit. Not because they're expensive or impossibly remote, though some are, but because they're forbidden. Locked away behind military orders, ancient traditions, ecological fragility, or natural dangers that need no fence. So settle in, let yourself relax into this moment, and join me as we explore 10 places that will remain, for most of us, forever just beyond reach. Our journey begins on a small island in the Bay of Bengal, where the last uncontacted people on Earth have made it absolutely clear they want nothing to do with the outside world. Imagine an island where time stopped moving forward thousands of years ago, where people live much as their ancestors did during the Stone Age, hunting and fishing with handmade tools, speaking a language no outsider understands, and violently rejecting every attempt at contact with the modern world. North Sentinel Island exists in the Bay of Bengal, part of India's Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, and its inhabitants, the Sentinelese, have chosen complete isolation over everything the 21st century might offer them. The island itself is small, roughly 8 square kilometers of dense jungle, surrounded by coral reefs that make approach treacherous. The Sentinelese population is estimated between 50 and 500 people. We genuinely don't know because they won't let anyone close enough to count. What we do know comes from brief, often violent encounters and observations from boats kept at a cautious distance by the very real threat of arrows fired with lethal accuracy. The Sentinelese aren't just unfriendly to visitors, they're actively hostile. In 1896, a British naval officer landed on the island after a week of searching for inhabitants. His party found recently abandoned villages but no people. They kidnapped an elderly couple and 4 children they eventually found, taking them to Port Blair. The elderly couple died quickly, possibly from disease their immune systems had never encountered. The children were returned with gifts, but this goodwill gesture apparently taught the Sentinelese that contact with outsiders meant death, a lesson they've never forgotten. Throughout the 20th century, the Indian government made various contact attempts. In 1967, the Indian Navy landed and left gifts of coconuts, pigs, and aluminum cookware on the beach. They were met with arrows. In the 1970s and 80s, anthropologist T.N. Pandit led periodic expeditions that would anchor offshore and leave coconuts floating toward the beach. Sometimes the Sentinelese would cautiously collect these gifts. Sometimes they would fire arrows. The expeditions never quite knew which response they'd get. The turning point came in 1991, when an expedition found the Sentinelese apparently willing to accept coconuts directly from anthropologists wading in shallow water. For a brief moment, it seemed contact might be possible, but anthropologists realized something crucial. Even peaceful contact could be deadly. The Sentinelese have no immunity to common diseases. A flu virus that would give an outsider a few days of misery could exterminate the entire tribe. Whatever knowledge might be gained from contact wasn't worth risking the extinction of one of Earth's last uncontacted peoples. In 1996, India officially abandoned all contact attempts and established a 3-mile exclusion zone around the island. North Sentinel Island became legally off-limits, protected not just by the Sentinelese arrows, but by Indian law that makes unauthorized approach a criminal offense. The policy recognizes the Sentinelese right to choose isolation and acknowledges that the greatest respect we can show them is leaving them alone. This policy was tested dramatically in 2006 when 2 fishermen illegally approached the island and were killed. The Sentinelese buried the bodies on the beach. Indian authorities decided not to attempt body recovery, recognizing that any rescue mission would risk more lives and violate the protection policy. The fishermen's deaths were tragic, but they had knowingly violated the exclusion zone. Then came 2018, and John Allen Chow, an American missionary who believed it was his calling to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese. Chow paid fishermen to take him near the island, ignoring the exclusion zone and the warnings of anthropologists who explained the deadly risks, both to himself and to the people he wanted to convert. On November 17, 2018, Chow approached the beach. The Sentinelese made their position clear, firing arrows and making threatening gestures. Chow retreated but returned the next day with gifts and religious materials. This time, the Sentinelese killed him. His body was never recovered, and once again, Indian authorities decided that attempting recovery would risk more lives and violate the tribe's clear wishes to be left alone. Chow's death sparked global debate. Some saw him as a martyr, others viewed his actions as colonialist arrogance that endangered an entire people. Anthropologists and public health experts were unanimous. Chow's presence could have introduced diseases that might have killed everyone on the island. His mission, however well-intentioned he believed it to be, represented an existential threat to the Sentinelese. What do we actually know about these people? Very little. They appear to be hunter-gatherers who have lived on the island for at least 30,000 years, possibly descended from the first humans to migrate from Africa to Asia. They fish, they collect plants, they craft tools from materials available on the island. They build temporary shelters rather than permanent structures. They don't appear to practice agriculture, living instead entirely on what they can hunt, gather, and catch. Their language is completely unknown, possibly unrelated to other Andamanese languages. Their social structure, beliefs, stories, and understanding of the world beyond their island remain mysteries. We don't know if they have legends about the outside world, if they understand that a vast civilization exists beyond their reef, or if they simply see occasional ships and helicopters as strange phenomena they've learned to drive away with arrows. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami raised concerns about the Sentinelese. The massive waves devastated other Andaman islands, and many feared North Sentinel Island's population might have been wiped out. Indian helicopters flew over the island to assess damage. A Sentinelese man emerged from the jungle and fired an arrow at the helicopter. A defiant gesture that confirmed the tribe had survived and wanted no help, no contact, and no outsiders, even in the aftermath of natural disaster. Why does North Sentinel Island remain forbidden? The answer is both simple and profound. The Sentinelese have chosen isolation, and that choice deserves respect. Contact would almost certainly harm them through disease introduction, even if intentions were peaceful. And perhaps most importantly, they represent something increasingly rare on Earth. A people living completely outside modern civilization, a reminder that our way of life isn't the only way of life, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom is recognizing what we don't need to know, places we don't need to go, and peoples who should be left to their own destinies. North Sentinel Island will remain forbidden, its beaches untouched by tourists, its people living as their ancestors did, their language unrecorded, their stories untold beyond their own community. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. In a world where nearly every corner has been explored, mapped, and cataloged, perhaps we need places that remain mysteries, peoples who remind us that not everything is ours to discover, and islands that teach us the value of respecting boundaries even when curiosity pulls us forward. Beneath Vatican City, stretching through miles of shelves in climate-controlled rooms, lies one of the most restricted document collections on Earth. The Vatican Secret Archives, recently rebranded as the Vatican Apostolic Archives, contains over 600 years' worth of documents, though some items date back nearly 2 millennia. These aren't secret in the sense of hidden conspiracies or suppressed scandals, but rather in the original Latin meaning of the word secretum, private, belonging to the person of the Pope. The archives contain approximately 85 kilometers of shelving holding millions of documents. That's about 53 miles of history, correspondence, papal decrees, and records of nearly every significant event that touched the Catholic Church over its long history. Letters from Michelangelo requesting payment for his work on the Sistine Chapel. Henry VIII's petition for annulment from Catherine of Aragon, complete with seals from English nobles supporting the request. Documents related to Galileo's trial. Correspondence about the Crusades. Records from the Inquisition. Treaties, bulls, briefs, and the daily bureaucratic workings of an institution that has functioned continuously for nearly 2,000 years. But here's the thing about the Vatican archives. They're not actually secret in the conspiratorial sense that popular culture imagines. Scholars can access them, but through a process so restrictive that it might as well be forbidden to most people. First, you need legitimate scholarly credentials and a research proposal specific enough that archivists can direct you to relevant documents. You can't browse. You can't ask to see anything interesting. You must know what you're looking for, request specific documents, and justify why you need to see them. Even qualified scholars face limitations. You can request only 3 documents or folders per day. Photography is forbidden for most materials. You work in a reading room under supervision, and you cannot under any circumstances access the stacks yourself. The archivists retrieve requested documents and return them when you're finished. This means that fully researching a single topic might require months or years of repeated visits, requesting documents 3 at a time, piecing together information like solving a vast jigsaw puzzle while blindfolded. The archives weren't open to outside scholars at all until 1881, when Pope Leo XIII decided that historical research could serve the Church's interests by providing transparent access to its records. Even then, access was heavily restricted, and certain sections remained completely closed. The most controversial restriction involved documents related to World War II and Pope Pius XII's actions or inactions regarding the Holocaust. These files weren't opened until 2020, and historians are still working through them, trying to understand the full picture of what the Vatican knew when they knew it, and why they responded as they did. Some of the archive's most famous documents have been studied extensively. The papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther, launching the Protestant Reformation, has been examined by countless scholars. Records of the trial of the Knights Templar, revealing the charges against them and the proceedings that led to the order's dissolution, have been published and analyzed. Correspondence regarding the Spanish conquest of the Americas, including debates about the treatment of indigenous peoples, has been made available to researchers. But much remains difficult or impossible to access. Documents less than 75 years old are generally closed, a policy meant to protect living people who might be mentioned in correspondence or records. Certain sensitive materials remain restricted even beyond this timeframe. And the sheer volume of documents means that vast portions of the archives have never been systematically cataloged or studied. There are documents no modern scholar has ever seen simply because no one knows they exist or knows to request them specifically. The physical preservation challenges are immense. Some documents are written on parchment that's over 1,000 years old. Others are on paper that's deteriorating despite climate control and careful storage. The Vatican employs conservators who work constantly to stabilize documents, digitize the most fragile items, and ensure that this vast record of human history survives. But digitization is slow and expensive, and much of the archive exists only in its original physical form. What secrets does the archive contain? Probably fewer than conspiracy theorists imagine, but the truth is we don't entirely know. The Vatican maintains that nothing in the archives would dramatically alter our understanding of church history or world events, that the documents simply provide details and context for events we already know occurred. But the restrictions make it impossible to verify this claim. We have to trust that if something historically significant were hidden in those miles of shelves, scholars would have found it by now. The archives reveal the Church as a vast bureaucracy that has been functioning for nearly 2,000 years. Every papal appointment, every land grant, every dispute between bishops, every petition from monarchs, every theological debate, all of it generated paperwork that flowed to Rome and was filed away. Reading through the archives isn't discovering dramatic secrets. It's wading through the mundane administrative workings of an institution that happens to be one of the oldest continuously operating organizations on Earth. Why do the archives remain so restricted? Partly it's practical. Allowing unlimited access would overwhelm the small staff and damage fragile documents. Partly it's protective. The Church wants to control how its history is interpreted and presented, and partly it's traditional. The archives have always been private, belonging to the Pope, and that tradition continues even as access has slowly expanded over the past century and a half. For most people, the Vatican archives will remain functionally forbidden. Unless you're a professional historian with specific research needs and the time and resources to spend months or years in Rome, you'll never see these documents firsthand. The archive serves as a reminder that not all forbidden places are geographic. Sometimes the most restricted spaces are rooms full of paper, and the barriers aren't walls or weapons, but bureaucracy, scholarship requirements, and the slow, deliberate pace of institutional access policies. The archives will continue expanding as long as the Church exists, adding new documents every year, extending those miles of shelving, preserving the ongoing record of an institution that has survived the fall of empires, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. And most of what they contain will remain, if not secret, then at least private, accessible only to the few who have the credentials, the persistence, and the very specific research questions that might unlock small portions of 2 millennia of carefully preserved history. In the Nevada desert, about 80 miles northwest of Las Vegas, a dry lakebed stretches flat and white under the relentless sun. At the southern end of this ancient lakebed sits a cluster of buildings, hangars, and runways that officially don't exist, or at least didn't exist in any government document until 2013, when the CIA finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. Area 51, also known as Groom Lake, is America's most famous secret military facility, a place where the boundaries between legitimate classified research and wild conspiracy theories have blurred so thoroughly that separating fact from fiction requires patience and careful attention to what we actually know versus what we imagine. Let's start with what's confirmed. Area 51 began in 1955 when the CIA needed a remote location to test the Utwo spy plane. The Utwo was designed to fly at altitudes above 60,000 feet, higher than any aircraft of its era, supposedly beyond the reach of Soviet air defenses. Testing such a revolutionary aircraft required secrecy and space away from prying eyes. The Groom Lake site, already used for military testing during World War II and surrounded by the Nevada Test and Training Range, a vast restricted area where nuclear weapons were tested, provided perfect isolation. The Utwo tests were successful, and Groom Lake became the CIA's preferred location for testing classified aircraft. When the OXCART program began developing the Atwelv, predecessor to the famous SR-71 Blackbird, testing occurred at Area 51. The facility expanded dramatically during this period, with new runways built to accommodate aircraft that pushed the boundaries of aerospace engineering. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, some of America's most advanced aircraft were tested in the Nevada desert, their existence unknown to the public, and sometimes even to most of the military. The stealth fighter development continued this pattern. The Phone 117 Nighthawk, America's first operational stealth aircraft, was tested at Area 51 throughout the 1980s. The aircraft's strange angular design, necessary to minimize radar reflection, looked so unusual that pilots and engineers joked it proved the principle that if you make something ugly enough, you can make it fly. The Phone 117 remained classified until 1988, years after it became operational. During that time, workers at Area 51 flew to work on unmarked planes from Las Vegas, worked on aircraft that didn't officially exist, and returned home without being able to tell their families what they did all day. Security around Area 51 is extreme and highly visible, despite the facility's supposed secrecy. The perimeter is patrolled by private security contractors, jokingly called camo dudes by UFO enthusiasts who watch the base from distant hills. These guards drive white pickup trucks, monitor visitors with binoculars and cameras, and will follow anyone who approaches the boundary too closely. The perimeter is marked with orange posts and signs warning that photography is prohibited, that deadly force is authorized, and that trespassers will be prosecuted. Beyond the security guards, motion sensors and cameras monitor the approaches. Military jets patrol the airspace. Anyone attempting to enter the restricted area will be detained, questioned, and prosecuted. The security exists because genuinely classified aircraft are tested at the facility, and the Air Force takes that security seriously. But the intense security has also fed conspiracy theories. If the government is hiding something this carefully, it must be hiding something big, right? The UFO connection to Area 51 began partly because of those classified aircraft tests. During the UTWO development, commercial airline pilots began reporting strange metallic aircraft flying at impossible altitudes, glinting in the sunlight at heights where no aircraft should be able to fly. These reports were genuine. Pilots were seeing the UTWO, but the Air Force couldn't explain what pilots had seen without compromising the program. So they attributed sightings to natural phenomena or didn't comment at all, which of course made people more suspicious. When Bob Lazar went public in 1989, claiming he'd worked at a site near Area 51 reverse engineering alien spacecraft, the connection between Area 51 and UFOs solidified in popular culture. Lazar's claims that the government possessed 9 alien craft, that he'd seen one operating, that they used an element that didn't exist on Earth, were spectacular and unverifiable. Investigators found no evidence Lazar had the educational credentials he claimed or had worked where he said he worked. But his story captured public imagination, and Area 51 became synonymous with aliens, UFOs, and government cover-ups in a way that transcended the reality of aircraft testing. The truth about Area 51 is simultaneously less exciting and more fascinating than alien spacecraft. The facility represents the cutting edge of aerospace engineering, where brilliant people push the boundaries of what's physically possible. The aircraft tested there look strange because they're designed to accomplish things no previous aircraft could accomplish. Flying higher, faster, or with radar signatures so small they're effectively invisible. The secrecy exists not because aliens are involved, but because these aircraft represent massive investments in research and capabilities that adversaries would desperately like to understand or counter. In recent years, satellite imagery has revealed much about Area 51's layout. We can see the runways, including one of the longest in the world at nearly 12,000 feet. We can see hangar facilities, support buildings, and evidence of ongoing expansion. We know that Janet Airlines operates daily flights from Las Vegas to the facility, carrying workers with security clearances who still can't talk about what they do. We know the facility remains active, and that classified aircraft are still being tested there. What we don't know is what's currently being developed. The next generation of stealth aircraft, hypersonic vehicles, unmanned aircraft with capabilities beyond current publicly known systems. The whole point of Area 51 is that we don't know. And we won't know until whatever's being tested there is either declassified or becomes operational years from now. The Beatwo stealth bomber, for instance, was being tested at Area 51 for years before the public knew it existed. Why does Area 51 remain forbidden? The answer is straightforward. It's an active military test facility where classified research occurs. Allowing public access would compromise that research, potentially revealing capabilities the United States military wants to keep secret from potential adversaries. The facility serves a genuine national security purpose, and maintaining that purpose requires keeping the public out. The irony is that Area 51's fame has made it less useful in some ways. Satellite surveillance by foreign governments can monitor activity at the site. Enthusiasts with powerful cameras and telephoto lenses watch from nearby hills. The intense public interest means anything seen near Area 51 immediately gets posted online and analyzed by thousands of people. This attention has led to some speculation that the most sensitive testing has moved elsewhere, to less famous facilities where public interest is minimal. For those who want to get as close as legally possible, public land near Area 51 allows views of the facility from miles away. The small town of Rachel, Nevada, about 25 miles from the facility, has embraced its connection to Area 51, naming its main road the Extraterrestrial Highway and operating a diner/motel called the Little Elen. These spots attract tourists who want to get as close to the forbidden facility as possible without risking arrest. But the facility itself remains completely off-limits. No tour are offered, no exceptions are made. The camo dudes don't joke around, and the prosecution threats are genuine. Area 51 will remain forbidden as long as it serves its purpose as a testing ground for aircraft and technologies that the United States government isn't ready to reveal to the world. Whether those technologies are as exotic as conspiracy theorists imagine or simply the next generation of conventional aircraft is something we won't know until secrecy is no longer necessary, which, given the history of the site, might be decades from now. On a rugged peninsula extending into the Aegean Sea from northern Greece, a community of about 2,000 Orthodox Christian monks maintains a way of life that has continued essentially unchanged for over 1,000 years. Mount Athos, also known as the Holy Mountain, is unique not just for its spiritual significance, but for a restriction that has been maintained since 1046 AD. No women are allowed. Not female tourists, not female researchers, not even female animals in most cases. This makes Mount Athos the world's only place where gender-based access restrictions have been continuously enforced for nearly a millennium. The peninsula is about 40 miles long and covers roughly 130 square miles of mountainous terrain. 20 Orthodox monasteries dot the landscape, each functioning as an independent community, while acknowledging the spiritual authority of the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. These monasteries range from massive fortified complexes that look like medieval castles to smaller, simpler establishments. Some house hundreds of monks, others maintain communities of just a dozen or so. Together, they form a monastic republic that governs itself according to traditions established centuries ago. The prohibition on women isn't unique to Mount Athos. It was common in Orthodox monasticism. But Athos is the last place where it's been continuously enforced. The ban, called avatin, meaning without access, applies to all female mammals, though the rule about female animals is inconsistently enforced. Cats and hens are common in many monasteries, and while the monks might claim these are male animals, the presence of kittens and eggs suggests otherwise. But female visitors. The ban is absolute and actively enforced by both the monks and Greek civil authorities. Why did this restriction begin? The official spiritual explanation involves the Virgin Mary, who supposedly blessed the peninsula and declared it her garden, and in her honor, no other women should set foot there. This tradition holds that Mount Athos belongs to the Mother of God, and allowing other women would be disrespectful to her unique status. The more practical historical explanation is that early monks sought complete separation from the outside world, and particularly from the temptations and distractions they associated with women. In medieval Orthodox spirituality, the presence of women was seen as fundamentally incompatible with the monastic goal of achieving spiritual purity through isolation and prayer. Visiting Mount Athos requires special permission even for men. The number of non-Orthodox visitors is limited to just 10 per day. Orthodox pilgrims can number up to 100 daily, but they still need advance permits called diamonatarians. These permits specify which monasteries the visitor can stay at and how long they can remain on the peninsula, typically just a few days. The application process requires providing passport information, explaining your reasons for visiting, and demonstrating that you have legitimate interest in Orthodox monasticism. Once on the peninsula, visitors find themselves in a place that feels profoundly removed from the 21st century. Many monasteries maintain medieval schedules, rising for prayers in the middle of the night, eating simple communal meals, spending days in prayer, liturgy, and manual labor. There's no television, no internet in most monasteries, and limited connection to the outside world. Time itself operates differently. Some monasteries still use Byzantine time, which sets midnight at sunset, meaning clocks need daily adjustment as sunset times change. The architecture is extraordinary. Monasteries like the Great Lavra, founded in 963 AD, contain buildings that have stood for centuries, filled with Byzantine frescoes, ancient manuscripts, and religious artifacts. The libraries hold rare texts, some dating back over 1,000 years, documenting theology, history, and philosophy. These collections represent invaluable cultural and historical resources, but they're accessible only to the small number of scholars who can obtain permission to visit. The landscape itself is rugged and beautiful. Ancient paths wind through forests, connecting monasteries and hermitages. Mount Athos rises to over 6,000 feet at its southern tip, snow-capped much of the year, visible from miles away. The eastern side of the peninsula features dramatic cliffs falling straight to the sea. Hermit monks occasionally occupy caves in these cliffs, living in extreme isolation even from the monastic communities. But the ban on women makes this entire world inaccessible to half of humanity. Women can take boat tours that stay just outside the 500-meter restricted zone around the coast, catching glimpses of monasteries from the sea. But they cannot set foot on the peninsula, cannot visit the churches, cannot access the libraries, cannot experience the unique culture and history preserved there. For Orthodox Christian women who feel deep spiritual connection to monasticism, the ban is particularly painful. They're excluded from one of Orthodox Christianity's holiest sites, specifically because of their gender. The European Parliament has repeatedly called for the ban to be lifted, arguing that it constitutes gender discrimination incompatible with European Union principles. Greece, where Mount Athos is located, maintains that the monastic republic's special status, established in the Greek constitution, protects religious freedom and traditional practices. The monks argue that changing the 1,000-year tradition would fundamentally alter the character of their community and violate deeply held religious principles. Several women have attempted to violate the ban over the years. In 2008, 4 Moldovan women were arrested for attempting to enter the peninsula illegally. In 1953, Caryatid dancer Maria Poimanidou managed to disguise herself as a man and spent several days on Mount Athos before being discovered and expelled. These incidents are rare, and the monks and Greek authorities take violations seriously. The situation raises complicated questions about religious freedom versus equality principles. Should ancient religious traditions be preserved even when they conflict with modern values about gender equality? Does the spiritual importance of Mount Athos to Orthodox Christianity justify maintaining restrictions that would be illegal anywhere else in the European Union? Or does preserving exclusion based on gender, even for religious reasons, perpetuate discrimination that should no longer be tolerated in the 21st century? For the monks, the question isn't about whether women are equal or inferior. Many monks explain that the ban isn't about women's worthiness, but about maintaining a specific environment where men can pursue spiritual development without distraction. They argue that just as women-only spaces exist and are protected, men should be allowed spaces exclusively for male spiritual community. The fact that those spaces exclude half of humanity is, in their view, necessary for the kind of spiritual environment they're trying to create. Mount Athos will likely remain forbidden to women for the foreseeable future. The monks show no inclination to change their tradition. The Greek constitution protects their autonomy, and European pressure has not moved them to reconsider. For Orthodox women, for female scholars who study Byzantine history and art, for any woman interested in medieval monasticism, Mount Athos remains a place they will never experience firsthand. A living museum of medieval spirituality that maintains medieval restrictions into the modern age. The Holy Mountain stands as perhaps the world's oldest continuously enforced forbidden place. While other restricted sites have opened over time, while gender-based exclusions have mostly been dismantled across the developed world, Mount Athos maintains a tradition established nearly 1,000 years ago. Whether this represents admirable preservation of religious heritage or stubborn adherence to outdated discrimination depends on your perspective. But regardless of how you view it, Mount Athos remains one of the world's most significant places that you, if you're a woman, will definitively never be allowed to see. Between Venice and the Lido, accessible only by boat, a small island sits abandoned and slowly crumbling into the lagoon. Poveglia Island spans about 17 acres of overgrown vegetation, collapsed buildings, and a bell tower that leans precariously, its bell removed decades ago to prevent it from ringing on its own. Or so the local legend claims. The Italian government has forbidden access to Poveglia, not because of anything currently dangerous on the island, but because of its dark history and the very real danger posed by unstable structures. Yet the prohibition has only enhanced the island's reputation as one of Europe's most haunted locations, a place where centuries of suffering have supposedly left an indelible mark. Poveglia's documented history begins in 421 AD when people fleeing barbarian invasions settled there. For centuries, it was a peaceful, even prosperous place, a small community of farmers and fishermen living on the lagoon. That changed in 1348 when the Black Death arrived in Venice. As plague devastated the city, authorities needed somewhere to quarantine the sick and dying. Poveglia became that place. Ships carrying plague victims were directed to the island, where the sick were left to either recover or die, kept away from the healthy population. The Venetian response to plague was brutal by necessity. People showing symptoms were forcibly removed from their homes and taken to pest houses or quarantine islands. Poveglia became a dumping ground for the dying. Bodies were piled in mass graves or burned in huge pyres that smoked day and night. The soil of the island, some sources claim, contains the ashes and bones of over 100,000 plague victims. That number is probably exaggerated. The island isn't large enough to hold that many bodies even in mass graves. But the truth is that thousands certainly died there, and their remains are mixed into the earth beneath the overgrown weeds and collapsed buildings. Plague returned to Venice repeatedly over the following centuries, and each time, Poveglia served as a quarantine island. By the early 18th century, when Venice established a more organized system of pest houses, Poveglia's role as a dumping ground for the dying became official policy. A lazaretto or plague hospital was built on the island. Ships arriving in Venice from ports with plague would be directed to Poveglia for quarantine. Cargo was fumigated, passengers and crew examined, and anyone showing symptoms was left on the island until they recovered or died. The island's darkest chapter supposedly came in 1922, when a mental hospital was opened in the existing buildings. According to local legend, a sadistic doctor conducted experimental treatments on patients, performing lobotomies and other procedures without anesthesia in the bell tower. The stories claim that this doctor was driven mad by the ghosts of plague victims, haunted by visions of the dead, and eventually threw himself from the bell tower. His body supposedly lingered briefly in the air before falling, held aloft by ghostly hands that didn't want to let him escape so easily. Here's where we need to separate legend from history. There was indeed a mental hospital on Poveglia in the 20th century, but documentation about it is sparse. The stories about the sadistic doctor have never been verified and may be entirely fabricated. The bell tower story has all the hallmarks of urban legend: supernatural intervention, poetic justice, and details so specific they seem designed to shock rather than inform. The truth is probably more mundane. A psychiatric facility operated on the island for several decades, treating patients using the medical understanding of mental illness available at the time, which included some treatments we'd now consider barbaric, but which weren't unusual for that era. The hospital closed in 1968, and Poveglia was completely abandoned. The Italian government has made occasional attempts to develop the island or sell it, but these efforts have consistently failed. In 2014, the island was put up for auction with a 99-year lease, hoping to attract developers who might transform it into a luxury hotel or resort. An Italian businessman made the highest bid, but the deal fell through, and the island remains abandoned and forbidden. Why does the Italian government keep Poveglia closed? Officially, it's about safety and liability. The buildings are structurally unsound. Roofs have collapsed, floors are unstable, and the entire complex is dangerous to enter. Allowing public access would expose the government to liability if anyone were injured. There's also the issue of what to do with human remains that are undoubtedly mixed into the soil and may be scattered through the ruins. Any development would require archaeological surveys, and potentially the expensive and sensitive process of properly dealing with centuries-old mass graves. But the closure has created a perfect breeding ground for legends. Ghost hunting shows have featured Poveglia, usually filming from boats or from distant shores, since actually landing on the island is illegal. The shows present it as one of the world's most haunted locations, filled with the restless spirits of plague victims and tortured mental patients. These portrayals mix genuine historical tragedy with complete fabrication, creating a mythology around the island that bears only passing resemblance to its actual history. Locals sometimes claim that Venetian fishermen avoid the waters around Poveglia, that bones and human remains wash up on the shores, that the island is cursed and should never be disturbed. These stories persist despite the fact that Poveglia sits just a few miles from Venice, one of the world's most popular tourist destinations, and that plenty of boats pass near or even around the island daily without incident. The reality of Poveglia is sadder than any ghost story. It's a place where thousands of people died, often alone and in terrible suffering, separated from their families during their final hours. The plague victims sent there weren't evil people deserving of quarantine. They were simply sick, living in an era before medical science could treat bacterial infections. The mental patients supposedly housed there in the 20th century were people suffering from conditions we now understand better, treated with methods that were standard for the time, but which we now recognize as often ineffective or harmful. If Poveglia is haunted, it's haunted by genuine human tragedy, by the fear and suffering of people who died believing they'd been abandoned by their city, by the desperation of family members who couldn't visit dying loved ones, by the workers who had to manage the dead, and dying under conditions that must have been psychologically devastating. These ghosts don't need to be supernatural to be heartbreaking. The island remains forbidden, slowly crumbling into the lagoon. Trees and vines grow through buildings that once housed the sick and dying. The bell tower leans further each year, and eventually it will collapse entirely. The Italian government occasionally discusses what to do with Poveglia, whether to develop it, preserve it as a historical site, or simply let nature reclaim it entirely. But for now, it remains abandoned, accessible only to those willing to break the law and risk both prosecution and the very real danger of unstable structures. Poveglia Island represents a particular kind of forbidden place, one closed not because of military secrets or religious tradition, but because its history is too dark, its ruins too dangerous, and its association with death too strong for comfortable public access. It's a place most people would probably choose not to visit even if they could. A reminder that some places are forbidden because there's nothing there worth seeing except the accumulated weight of centuries of human suffering. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a safety test gone catastrophically wrong. The blast and subsequent fire released massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, creating the worst nuclear disaster in history. Within days, Soviet authorities evacuated over 100,000 people from a 30-kilometer zone around the plant. Those evacuated were told they'd return within a few days once the situation was under control. More than 3 decades later, large portions of that exclusion zone remain legally forbidden, a vast area where nature has reclaimed abandoned cities and radiation lingers in soil, water, and vegetation at levels that make long-term human habitation impossible. The immediate evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. Residents of Pripyat, the city built to house power plant workers just 2 miles from the reactor, were evacuated on April 27, about 36 hours after the explosion. They left everything behind: clothing, furniture, photographs, toys, all the accumulated possessions of daily life. The city was frozen in time, a snapshot of Soviet life in 1986, preserved by abandonment. In the following days and weeks, the evacuation expanded to include hundreds of smaller villages and settlements, as authorities recognized the extent of contamination. The exclusion zone isn't uniformly dangerous. Radiation levels vary dramatically depending on location, soil type, and proximity to areas where radioactive material concentrated. Some spots have radiation levels only slightly above background, while others remain dangerously radioactive decades later. The area immediately around Reactor 4 remains intensely contaminated. A massive steel and concrete structure called the New Safe Confinement, completed in 2016, encases the destroyed reactor, designed to contain radioactive material for at least 100 years. Despite the exclusion zone being legally forbidden for permanent residents, people do go there. First, there are the workers, thousands of people who maintain the containment structure, monitor radiation levels, and work at the 3 other Chernobyl reactors, which continued operating until 2000. These workers commute into the zone, work shifts, and leave. They're monitored for radiation exposure, and time limits ensure no one receives dangerous doses. Second, there are the resettlers, mostly elderly people who return to their homes in the exclusion zone illegally in the years after the disaster. Estimates suggest anywhere from 100 to 200 people now live in the zone, mostly in less contaminated areas. They're primarily elderly women who decided they'd rather live out their remaining years in their homes, accepting whatever radiation risks exist, than die in unfamiliar places. The Ukrainian government has generally tolerated their presence, providing minimal services and understanding that forcing elderly people from their homes would be both cruel and pointless. Third, there are tours. Since the early 2000s, organized tours have been allowed into portions of the exclusion zone. Tourists can visit Pripyat, see the abandoned amusement park with its iconic rusting Ferris wheel, walk through empty schools where textbooks still lie on desks, and photograph the eerie landscape of urban decay overtaken by nature. These tours stay in areas where radiation levels are relatively low. Guides carry Geiger counters, and visitors are instructed not to touch anything, sit on the ground, or take souvenirs. The tourism is controversial. Critics argue it's voyeuristic disaster tourism that disrespects the tragedy and the people who died. Supporters claim it's educational, helping people understand nuclear disasters and see the consequences of technological hubris. The truth is probably that it's both. Some visitors come away deeply moved and educated, while others simply want creepy photographs for social media. Fourth, there are the stalkers, illegal visitors who sneak into the restricted zone without permits, often to explore areas tours don't reach. The name comes from the Tarkovsky film Stalker, about guides who lead people through forbidden zones. These trespassers risk arrest, radiation exposure, and the very real dangers of unstable buildings. Ukrainian authorities patrol the zone and will detain and fine anyone caught entering illegally, but the zone is large and the borders impossible to completely secure. What's life like in the exclusion zone today? The answer depends entirely on where you are. In Pripyat, nature has aggressively reclaimed the city. Trees grow through apartment buildings, roots cracking concrete and pushing through windows. Vegetation covers streets once filled with people. The famous amusement park, set to open on May 1, 1986, just days after the disaster, sits rusting and overgrown. The Ferris wheel has become an icon of the disaster. Yellow gondolas faded and weathered, the structure slowly corroding, a symbol of interrupted normalcy and lost futures. Animals have returned in surprising numbers. Wolves, deer, wild boar, and even rare species like lynx and European bison now inhabit the zone. Some studies suggest wildlife populations are thriving, perhaps counterintuitively, because the absence of humans outweighs the negative effects of radiation. Other research indicates animals in the zone show genetic damage and reduced populations compared to uncontaminated areas. The truth is complex. Some species do well, others struggle, and the long-term effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure on wildlife populations remain subjects of ongoing research. The radiation itself is invisible but omnipresent. Cesium-137 and strontium-90, with half-lives of about 30 years, mean that contamination is slowly decreasing, but will remain significant for decades more. Plutonium isotopes with half-lives of thousands of years mean certain areas will remain contaminated essentially forever. The most dangerous areas aren't necessarily where you'd expect. The famous Red Forest, where trees killed by radiation turned reddish-brown and were later bulldozed and buried, remains highly contaminated. But radiation accumulated unpredictably, concentrated by rain patterns and vegetation, creating hot spots scattered throughout the zone. Could people ever return permanently? Some areas already have safe enough radiation levels for human habitation. The question is whether there's any reason to return. Pripyat is a ghost city with no infrastructure, no services, and buildings that have deteriorated beyond repair. The smaller villages are even less viable. The most contaminated areas will remain dangerous for generations. And the psychological weight of the disaster means few people want to return anyway. The exclusion zone serves an important purpose as an unintended experiment in what happens when humans suddenly vanish from a landscape. Researchers study how ecosystems respond to sudden absence of human activity, how wildlife adapts to contamination, and how the built environment deteriorates without maintenance. It's a living laboratory for understanding both ecological recovery and radioactive contamination. Why does the exclusion zone remain forbidden? The answer is obvious: radiation. Even in areas where levels are relatively low, long-term exposure creates health risks. The Ukrainian government has decided that protecting people from these risks outweighs any benefit from reopening the zone. The zone also serves as a buffer around the still dangerous reactor site, ensuring that even if contamination spread, it would spread into areas where no one lives. The disaster transformed over 1,000 square miles into a forbidden zone that will likely remain restricted for longer than anyone alive today will survive. The exclusion zone stands as a monument to technological disaster, a warning about nuclear power's risks, and an accidental nature preserve where wildlife thrives in humanity's absence. It's a place you can visit briefly under strict supervision, but never live, never truly inhabit. The invisible poison in soil and water ensures that what was once home to over 100,000 people will remain, for the foreseeable future, a place where humans are only temporary visitors, tolerated by a landscape that will outlast us all, slowly cleaning itself over timescales that dwarf human lifespans. In September 1940, 4 teenagers and a dog were exploring the countryside near Montignac in southwestern France, when they discovered a hole in the ground where a tree had fallen. Curious, they enlarged the opening and climbed down into what turned out to be a large cave system. Using crude lamps for light, they found themselves surrounded by images that would change our understanding of human history. The walls were covered with paintings, animals rendered in vivid colors with stunning detail and artistic skill. Bulls, horses, deer, aurochs, and mysterious geometric symbols covered the walls and ceilings. The Lascaux caves contained some of the finest examples of Paleolithic art ever discovered, created roughly 17,000 years ago by people we've never fully understood. The discovery was immediately recognized as extraordinary. After World War II ended, the French government took control of the site, and by 1948, Lascaux was opened to the public. The response was overwhelming. Visitors flooded to see these ancient paintings, and by the early 1960s, the caves were receiving over 1,200 visitors per day during peak season. That's approximately 400,000 people per year walking through spaces that had been sealed and undisturbed for millennia, breathing, touching, bringing heat and moisture and carbon dioxide into a delicate environment that had remained stable for thousands of years. The paintings began to deteriorate almost immediately. The first problem was green sickness. Algae and moss started growing on the walls, fed by light, moisture, and carbon dioxide from visitors' breath. The temperature in the caves increased from the body heat of hundreds of daily visitors. The humidity rose from their breathing. The stable environment that had preserved the paintings for 17,000 years was being destroyed in just over a decade. In 1955, conservators installed a climate control system, but this inadvertently created new problems. The system created condensation that encouraged bacterial and fungal growth. By the early 1960s, white calcite deposits were forming on some paintings, threatening to obscure them entirely. Black fungal growths appeared. The paintings that had survived intact for 170 centuries were being destroyed in less than 2 decades of public exposure. In 1963, André Malraux, France's Minister of Culture, made a difficult decision. Lascaux would be closed to the public indefinitely. The daily visitor limit was reduced to 5 people, usually conservators, researchers, and occasionally very special visitors like heads of state. Everyone else would be denied access to one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. The paintings would be saved by hiding them from the world. The closure was controversial. People who'd never had a chance to see the caves felt cheated. Art historians argued that hiding such important cultural heritage from humanity defeated the purpose of preserving it. But the conservators were adamant. Continued public access would destroy the paintings completely. Better to preserve them unseen than to let them be destroyed by tourism. Even with drastically limited access, problems continued. In 2001, a new fungus appeared despite all precautions. Fusarium solani, likely introduced on someone's shoes or clothing, began growing on the paintings. This outbreak prompted even stricter controls. Visitors were limited even further. Anyone entering had to undergo rigorous decontamination procedures, and no one was allowed to stay in the caves longer than absolutely necessary. In 2008, another crisis emerged when black stains appeared on some paintings. These turned out to be colonies of Ochroconus lascaux, a previously unknown fungus apparently unique to Lascaux. Fighting these outbreaks required careful application of antibiotics and biocides. Work done with extreme caution to avoid damaging the paintings while eliminating the biological threats. The fundamental problem is that human presence introduces contamination. We carry bacteria and fungal spores on our bodies, clothing, and equipment. We breathe out carbon dioxide that feeds plant growth. Our body heat changes cave temperature. Our movement creates air currents. No matter how careful visitors are, their mere presence alters the cave environment in ways that encourage biological growth. So if the public can't visit Lascaux, how do people see these remarkable paintings? The answer is replicas. In 1983, France opened Lascaux II, a painstaking recreation of the most famous sections of the original cave. Artists spent years carefully copying the paintings, reproducing not just the images, but the texture and contours of the cave walls themselves. The replica was built just a few hundred meters from the original and receives the visitors that can no longer enter the real caves. In 2016, Lascaux IV opened, an even more elaborate recreation using modern technology. The entire cave system was laser mapped, and artists created full-scale replicas with astonishing accuracy. Visitors walk through spaces that match the original caves in almost every detail except the one that matters most. They're not real. They're extraordinarily faithful copies, but copies nonetheless. Does this solution satisfy? For most people, probably yes. The replicas are impressive, the paintings beautiful, and the interpretive materials educational. For art historians and those who understand the significance of original artifacts, something essential is lost. Seeing a copy, no matter how accurate, isn't the same as standing in the actual space where ancient humans created these images, touching walls they touched, breathing air in spaces they occupied. But there's no alternative. The original Lascaux caves are simply too fragile to withstand public visitation. The choice is between preserving the originals unseen or destroying them through exposure. The French government chose preservation, and that choice means that one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements will remain forbidden to the vast majority of humans forever. A tiny number of people still see the originals. Conservators who must enter regularly to monitor conditions, fight biological invasions, and maintain the systems that regulate temperature and humidity. Occasionally, researchers with compelling reasons are granted access under strict protocols. And very rarely, special visitors like presidents or royalty are allowed brief, carefully controlled visits. But for everyone else, Lascaux exists only through photographs, videos, and replicas. The caves represent a particular kind of tragedy. We found something precious, damaged it through ignorance and enthusiasm, and now must keep it hidden to preserve what remains. It's a reminder that sometimes loving something means accepting that you cannot have it, that preservation requires renunciation. and that not everything humans create needs to be accessible to everyone. The paintings themselves remain in the darkness, seen by perhaps a dozen people per year at most, watched over by instruments and cameras, their beauty preserved by isolation. The aurochs and horses and deer gallop across cave walls in images rendered 17,000 years ago, surviving in darkness as they have for most of their existence, hidden once again from human eyes by the same species that created them. They're safer this way, preserved by prohibition, protected by the very inaccessibility that makes them so tantalizing to those who will never be allowed to see them. On November 14, 1963, a fishing crew sailing near Iceland's Westman Islands noticed something strange. Columns of dark smoke rising from the ocean. Initially they thought a ship was on fire, but as they approached, they realized they were witnessing something far more remarkable. An underwater volcano was erupting, and within days, a new island was rising from the North Atlantic. By the time the eruption ended in June 1967, Surtsey Island had grown to about 1 square mile of volcanic rock and ash, a brand new piece of land where none had existed before. Iceland's government made an immediate decision that would shape Surtsey's entire future. The island would be a natural laboratory, accessible only to approved scientists, completely protected from any human activity that might interfere with natural processes. From the moment it cooled enough for life to begin establishing, Surtsey would be watched, measured, and documented, but never settled, developed, or casually visited. For over half a century, that policy has remained in place, making Surtsey perhaps the world's most scientifically important forbidden island. Why is Surtsey so valuable to science? Because it's a blank slate. When volcanic rock first emerges from the ocean, it's sterile. No plants, no animals, no microorganisms, nothing alive. Scientists knew that eventually life would colonize the island, but they'd never had the opportunity to watch that process from the absolute beginning. How does life find a new island? What arrives first? In what order do different species establish? How does an ecosystem develop from nothing? Surtsey provided a unique opportunity to answer these questions. The first life to arrive were bacteria and fungi, probably blown by wind or carried on debris washed ashore. These microscopic colonizers began the slow process of breaking down volcanic rock into something that would eventually become soil. Seeds arrived next, some carried by wind, others in the droppings of birds that visited the island. The first plant, a sea rocket, was discovered growing on Surtsey in 1965, just 2 years after the island formed. Birds were crucial to colonization. Seabirds began nesting on Surtsey within years of its formation, bringing seeds in their droppings and sometimes on their feathers. Their guano provided nitrogen-rich fertilizer that helped plants establish. By the 1970s, several hardy plant species had established permanent populations on the island. Researchers carefully documented each new species that arrived, noting when and where it was first seen, whether it successfully reproduced, and how it interacted with other species. The colonization process hasn't been uniform or predictable. Some species that arrived early disappeared later, apparently unable to compete once other species established. Some plants that researchers expected would thrive failed to gain a foothold. The order in which different species arrived and established created path dependencies. The presence of one species could make it easier or harder for others to establish later. By the 2000s, Surtsey had developed a surprisingly diverse ecosystem. Over 70 species of vascular plants had been recorded, though not all persisted. The island hosted nesting colonies of several seabird species. Insects arrived, probably blown by wind or carried by birds. Gray seals began using the beaches. Even a single pair of ravens established territory on the island, apparently finding enough food from the bird colonies to sustain themselves. But here's what makes Surtsey unique. All of this colonization has been purely natural. No one has introduced species deliberately. No one has planted gardens or brought pets. The only human presence has been scientists making careful observations while disturbing the island as little as possible. This makes Surtsey the only place on Earth where we have a complete record of how an island ecosystem develops from absolute zero, with no human interference. The restrictions on access are strict. Only scientists with approved research projects can visit, and even they must follow rigorous protocols. Before landing, researchers must clean their equipment and clothing to avoid accidentally introducing seeds, insects, or microorganisms. They must walk only on designated paths to avoid damaging vegetation or disturbing nesting birds. They cannot leave anything behind or take anything away except data and samples specifically collected for research. No camping is allowed. Scientists visit for the day and leave, staying in nearby inhabited islands. Tourists occasionally ask to visit Surtsey, and the answer is always no. There are no exceptions for wealthy visitors, no celebrity tour, no educational field trips. The island's scientific value requires that it remain as pristine as possible, which means keeping out anyone who doesn't have a specific, approved research purpose. Even researchers from nearby Iceland's universities must apply for permits and justify their need to access the island. The policy has been tested. In 2009, a wealthy American explorer attempted to land on Surtsey without permission, claiming he had a right to visit as part of exploring the world. He was intercepted by authorities before reaching the island and faced legal consequences. The incident reinforced Iceland's commitment to keeping Surtsey closed. What have scientists learned from Surtsey? Enormous amounts about island biogeography, succession, colonization patterns, and ecosystem development. The island has become a living textbook for ecology students worldwide, even though most will never see it in person. Research papers about Surtsey number in the hundreds, documenting everything from soil development to bird nesting patterns to plant genetics. One particularly interesting finding involves the role of seabirds in creating terrestrial ecosystems on oceanic islands. The nutrients that birds bring from the ocean, through their droppings and the remains of fish they bring to feed their chicks, are crucial for establishing vegetation. Without seabird colonies, many plants might never have successfully established on Surtsey. This suggests that on newly formed volcanic islands, the arrival of seabirds may be a critical step in developing terrestrial ecosystems. Researchers have also documented how erosion reshapes new volcanic islands. Surtsey was larger when eruptions ended than it is today. Wave action has eroded the softer volcanic material, particularly on the southern side of the island. Scientists predict that Surtsey will eventually erode away completely, perhaps in a few thousand years, though the harder core of the island may persist much longer. Watching this erosion process in real time provides valuable data about how volcanic islands evolve geologically. Climate change adds new research dimensions. Surtsey's location in the North Atlantic makes it sensitive to changing ocean temperatures and storm patterns. How climate change affects the island's ecosystems. The timing of bird nesting, the success of different plant species, the rate of erosion, will be carefully documented. Surtsey may become an important indicator of how climate change affects isolated island ecosystems. In 2008, UNESCO designated Surtsey a World Heritage Site, recognizing both its scientific importance and the success of keeping it pristine for research. The designation strengthens legal protections and international recognition of the island's value. It also means that preserving Surtsey isn't just Iceland's decision, but an internationally recognized obligation. Will Surtsey ever be open to the public? Almost certainly not. The scientific value of maintaining it as an untouched natural laboratory far exceeds any benefit from allowing tourism. The island is too small and fragile to withstand regular visitors, and the risk of accidentally introducing invasive species is too high. Even with the strictest protocols, public access would inevitably compromise the island's scientific value. For those who want to see Surtsey, boat tours operate from nearby inhabited islands, staying at least 200 meters from shore. You can see the island's cliffs, maybe spot seabirds, and imagine what researchers find when they're allowed to land. But that's as close as most people will ever get. Surtsey remains a scientific sanctuary, a place where nature operates without human interference, where colonization and succession proceed purely according to ecological processes, observed but not influenced by humanity. It's forbidden not to keep secrets, but to preserve scientific integrity. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give to knowledge is the discipline to leave something alone, to watch without touching, to learn by letting nature proceed on its own terms, undisturbed by the very observers who find it so fascinating. About 90 miles off the coast of São Paulo, Brazil, a small rocky island rises from the Atlantic Ocean. Ilha de Queimada Grande covers only about 110 acres, mostly steep rocky slopes with patches of vegetation. On the surface, it might seem like countless other small islands scattered along Brazil's coast. But Ilha de Queimada Grande has earned a more memorable name, Snake Island, and it's one of the few places on Earth forbidden by its own deadliness. The island is home to one of the world's most venomous snakes, the golden lancehead pit viper, and these snakes exist nowhere else on Earth and exist here in terrifying concentration. Estimates of the golden lancehead population on Snake Island vary wildly. Some sources claim 1 snake per square meter in the densest areas, though this is probably exaggerated. More conservative estimates suggest several thousand snakes on the island, which still means you're never far from multiple deadly serpents. The golden lancehead is a close relative of the mainland jararaca, one of the most dangerous snakes in South America, but the island population has evolved distinct characteristics during thousands of years of isolation. The golden lanceheads are pit vipers, meaning they hunt using heat-sensing organs that detect warm-blooded prey. On the mainland, their relatives primarily hunt terrestrial prey like rodents, but Snake Island has no terrestrial mammals. No rats, no mice, nothing for snakes to hunt on the ground. Instead, the golden lanceheads have adapted to hunt birds, particularly migratory birds that stop on the island to rest. This dietary specialization has driven the evolution of unusually potent venom that can rapidly kill birds, preventing them from flying away after being bitten. That venom is bad news for humans. Golden lancehead venom contains powerful hemotoxins that cause tissue death, bleeding, and without treatment can lead to kidney failure and death. Envenomation causes severe pain, swelling, bruising, and blistering at the bite site. The venom is estimated to be 3 to 5 times more potent than that of the mainland jararaca, which already kills several people in Brazil each year. There is no specific antivenom for golden lancehead bites. Treatment involves general pit viper antivenom and supportive care, but outcomes can be poor if medical help isn't immediately available. How did this island become so dominated by a single snake species? The answer lies in sea level changes. During the last ice age, when ocean levels were lower, Snake Island was connected to the mainland. The snake population at that time was probably just part of the general coastal jararaca population. But as ice melted and sea levels rose about 11,000 years ago, the island became separated from the mainland. The snakes that happened to be on that piece of land were suddenly isolated, cut off from the mainland population. Without terrestrial mammals to hunt, the snakes had to adapt or die. Some individuals happened to have genetic variations that made them slightly better at catching birds. Those individuals survived and reproduced. Over thousands of generations, natural selection produced snakes specialized for hunting birds, with more potent venom and behaviors suited to their arboreal lifestyle. The golden lancehead became a distinct species, found nowhere else on Earth, a perfect example of island evolution, creating unique forms adapted to specific conditions. The island's dangerous reputation is well earned. Local legends in coastal Brazilian communities tell stories about Snake Island's deadliness, often exaggerated but based on real dangers. One persistent story claims that the last lighthouse keeper and his family were killed when snakes entered the lighthouse through a window, forcing them to flee and fall to their deaths from the cliffs. While this story is probably fabricated or heavily embellished, it captures the genuine fear Snake Island inspires. There was indeed a lighthouse on Snake Island, operated from 1909 to the 1920s. But it was automated precisely because keeping staff there was too dangerous and difficult. The lighthouse still stands, though it's been unmaintained for decades. Occasionally, Brazilian Navy personnel visit to service the automated light, but these visits are brief, carefully planned, and conducted with extreme caution. The Brazilian government has made Snake Island off-limits to the public for obvious reasons. The Brazilian Navy enforces the restriction, prohibiting unauthorized vessels from approaching within a certain distance. Occasionally, scientific researchers are granted permission to visit for brief, carefully controlled studies, but even these expeditions are risky. Scientists who study the golden lancehead do so knowing that a single bite could be fatal, that medical help is 90 miles an hour away, and that no antivenom specifically targets this snake's venom. Why do scientists risk visiting? Because the golden lancehead is critically endangered. Found only on this single small island, the entire species could be wiped out by a single catastrophic event. A disease outbreak, a severe storm, a fire. The population is small enough that genetic diversity is limited, potentially making the snakes vulnerable to health problems. Conservation biologists want to understand the snake's population dynamics, genetics, and ecology to develop conservation strategies. But every research visit must balance scientific value against both the risk to researchers and the risk of accidentally introducing invasive species that could devastate the island's ecosystem. Poachers occasionally attempt to reach Snake Island to capture golden lanceheads for the illegal wildlife trade. These snakes are rare, dangerous, and consequently valuable to reptile collectors who seek exotic species regardless of laws or conservation concerns. The Brazilian government takes wildlife smuggling seriously, and anyone caught attempting to land on Snake Island or capture golden lanceheads faces criminal penalties. But enforcement is challenging. The island is remote, the coastline is long, and determined criminals can sometimes slip through surveillance. The golden lancehead's future is uncertain. Climate change could alter the island's environment in ways that affect snake survival. The migratory birds that the snakes depend on could change their migration patterns. Rising sea levels could eventually submerge portions of the island. Introduced species, rats escaping from a visiting boat, invasive ants carried on equipment, disease-carrying mosquitoes, could disrupt the ecosystem. The snake's complete dependence on this single small island makes them extraordinarily vulnerable. Conservation efforts have included proposals to establish captive breeding populations as insurance against extinction in the wild. Some golden lanceheads are kept in zoos and research institutions, though breeding programs face challenges. The snake's specialized diet makes them difficult to maintain in captivity, and ensuring genetic diversity in a captive population requires careful management. For most people, Snake Island's forbidden status is perfectly fine. Unlike some restricted places where exclusion feels frustrating, few people actually want to visit an island densely populated with deadly venomous snakes. The prohibition serves both to protect humans from the snakes and to protect the critically endangered snakes from humans. It's one of the few places on Earth where danger creates its own effective barrier, where nature has provided its own keep out sign more effective than any fence or guard. Boat tour occasionally pass near the island, staying well offshore, allowing tourists to photograph the rocky shores and contemplate what lives there. But no one wants to get closer. Snake Island remains forbidden, its golden lanceheads hunting in the vegetation, utterly unconcerned about human curiosity, protected by their own deadliness, and by laws that recognize some places are better left to the creatures that already claim them. Sometimes nature doesn't need our protection because it's perfectly capable of protecting itself, and the best thing we can do is simply stay away. In central China, near the modern city of Xi'an, a large earthen mound rises from agricultural land. The mound appears natural, weathered by over 2 millennia of wind and rain, covered in vegetation. But hidden beneath that mound lies one of the greatest archaeological treasures ever discovered, and one that archaeologists have deliberately chosen not to excavate. This is the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, the man who unified China in 221 BCE, and who arranged to be buried in a vast underground palace filled with treasures beyond imagining. We know the tomb is there. We know roughly what it contains. And we've decided to leave it sealed, at least for now, making it perhaps the world's most significant, deliberately unopened archaeological site. What we know about the tomb comes from ancient texts, particularly the records of the grand historian written by Sima Qian about a century after Qin Shi Huang's death. Sima Qian's account describes the tomb construction in remarkable detail. According to him, the tomb chamber replicates the world as Qin Shi Huang knew it. A ceiling decorated with celestial bodies, a floor featuring maps of his empire with rivers and seas recreated in flowing mercury, and mechanical devices that would shoot arrows at anyone who entered unauthorized. The tomb supposedly took 700,000 workers over 30 years to construct, making it one of the most massive construction projects in ancient history. The burial mound itself is huge, originally over 100 meters tall, though erosion has reduced it to about 76 meters today. The base covers approximately 56 square kilometers, but the tomb chamber is actually beneath this mound, deep underground. Its exact depth uncertain, but estimated at between 26 and 30 meters below the surface. The entire complex, including the underground palace and the surrounding structures, covers about 60 square kilometers. That's roughly the size of a small city, all constructed to serve the emperor in death. We know the tomb exists because of the terracotta army, discovered in 1974 by local farmers digging a well about a mile from the burial mound. That discovery revealed thousands of life-sized clay warriors, each individually crafted with unique features, arranged in military formation as if guarding the emperor's tomb. Further excavation revealed multiple pits containing not just warriors, but horses, chariots, acrobats, officials, and even bronze waterfowl arranged in artificial rivers. The terracotta army is considered one of archaeology's greatest discoveries, but it's just the outer guardian of the tomb complex, not the tomb itself. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have confirmed the existence of the underground palace. Surveys have detected a large sealed chamber beneath the mound, along with extensive underground structures. Soil samples from the area contain unusually high mercury levels, potentially confirming Sima Qian's claim that mercury rivers were created inside the tomb. The mercury would have served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practical as a preservative and to deter looters, symbolic as representing the rivers of China. So why not excavate? Why leave what might be the richest archaeological site in the world sealed and untouched? The answer involves multiple concerns, all valid, all weighing against our natural curiosity. First, there's preservation technology. Modern archaeology has advanced tremendously since the terracotta army was first excavated in the 1970s. But even with current technology, archaeologists struggle to preserve some materials once they're exposed to air after millennia of sealed preservation. The terracotta warriors provide a cautionary tale. When first uncovered, many were still painted in vivid colors. But exposure to air caused the paint to dry, crack, and flake off within minutes to hours. Despite archaeologists' best efforts, most of the color was lost. Imagine applying this problem to an entire underground palace filled with organic materials. Silk, wood, bamboo, lacquer. That might disintegrate upon exposure. Second, there's the mercury. If Simocaion's account is accurate, the tomb contains tons of mercury in liquid form, probably used to create flowing rivers and as a preservative. Mercury is extremely toxic, and entering a sealed space containing large quantities of mercury vapor would be deadly. Any excavation would need to address this hazard, both for the workers and for the surrounding environment. Releasing that much mercury could create serious environmental contamination. Third, there's political sensitivity. Qin Shi Huang is a controversial figure in Chinese history. He unified China and initiated projects like the Great Wall, but he's also remembered for burning books, burying scholars alive, and ruling through fear and violence. His tomb is a sensitive site, and any excavation would need to carefully navigate how his legacy is presented and interpreted. The Chinese government must balance historical interest with contemporary political considerations. Fourth, there's the question of what excavation would accomplish. The terracotta army and surrounding structures have already provided enormous amounts of information about Qin dynasty craftsmanship, military organization, and burial practices. The tomb itself would certainly contain treasures and artifacts, but what crucial historical questions would it answer that can't be addressed through less invasive methods? Is satisfying curiosity worth risking the destruction of irreplaceable artifacts? Chinese archaeologists have been remarkably conservative about the tomb, explicitly stating that current preservation technology isn't adequate to excavate safely. They've argued that rushing to excavate would risk destroying what they're trying to preserve. Better to wait, they reason, for technology to advance further. Better to learn from the terracotta army and from other excavations. Better to develop methods that can preserve organic materials and handle toxic hazards before opening the emperor's final resting place. This restraint is admirable and increasingly common in modern archaeology. The discipline has moved away from the treasure-hunting mentality of early archaeology toward conservation and preservation. Archaeologists increasingly argue that not everything needs to be excavated now, that sometimes the most responsible choice is to leave sites undisturbed for future generations, who will have better technology and better understanding. Still, the unopened tomb tantalizes. What treasures lie within? The accounts describe the emperor buried in a jade suit. Jade was believed to preserve the body. Surrounded by models of his palaces, treasures from across his empire, and provisions for the afterlife. Simacaion mentions that craftsmen who built the tomb were sealed inside to protect its secrets, and that the tomb's entrance was concealed after the burial. These claims may be exaggerated, but they suggest the tomb contains not just treasures, but historical information about Qin dynasty technology, art, and beliefs about death and the afterlife. Remote sensing continues to improve. Ground-penetrating radar gets more sophisticated, able to create increasingly detailed images of underground structures. Chemical analysis of soil provides more information about what might be preserved inside. Perhaps future technology will allow virtual excavation, using sensors to map and even identify contents without physical disturbance. Such technology could satisfy curiosity while leaving the tomb physically intact. Would future archaeologists thank us for leaving the tomb sealed or curse us for our timidity? The question has no certain answer, but the decision to wait reflects a mature understanding of archaeology's limits and responsibilities. Not everything that can be excavated should be excavated immediately. Some sites are too important, too fragile, or too poorly understood to risk. Qin Shi Huang's tomb remains forbidden not by law that prevents access, but by professional consensus that excavation would be irresponsible with current technology. Tourists can visit the mound, walk around it, see the terracotta army in nearby museums. But the tomb itself, the underground palace, the mercury rivers, the treasures, the emperor's body, all remain sealed, untouched, waiting beneath the earth for a future generation that might be ready to open it properly. It's a remarkable exercise in restraint, in valuing preservation over discovery, in accepting that not knowing can be better than knowing if knowledge requires destruction. The emperor lies in his underground kingdom, guarded by his clay army, surrounded by mercury rivers and mechanical defenses, waiting in darkness as he has for over 2,200 years. And there he'll remain, sealed away from the world, forbidden by wisdom rather than fear, protected by the recognition that some treasures are safer unopened, until we're truly ready to see them without destroying them. Sometimes the greatest archaeological discovery is the one we choose not to make. Tonight, we've traveled to 10 remarkable places that share one quality. They're forbidden to us, closed off by law, tradition, danger, or wisdom. These forbidden places teach us that boundaries serve purposes beyond frustrating our desire to see everything. They protect peoples who have chosen isolation, preserve treasures too fragile for exposure, guard secrets that serve security, and maintain natural laboratories where science learns by watching without interfering. They remind us that sometimes wisdom means accepting limits, that not everything needs to be accessible, and that some places serve humanity better when we stay away. Thank you for joining me on this journey through 10 places you'll never be allowed to visit. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find satisfaction in the places you can explore, peace in accepting the boundaries that protect what's precious, and the wisdom to recognize that some mysteries are more valuable unanswered.